Professor Howard Williams takes you on a journey through time and space, exploring death and memory, past and present. Archaeodeath.
Archaeodeathlings, welcome to another Archaeodeath interview with myself, Professor Howard Williams, and another exciting interdisciplinary guest. Chella, please tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Hi, Archaeodeathlings. Hi, Howard. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here. I am, in at least one of my hats, a lecturer in classical studies at the Open University. Yeah, and in that capacity, I do some of the things you expect of an academic. I write books, I do research. I also try to communicate about the ancient world and especially about the way that contemporary politics framed the ancient world on various social media platforms. And that's how I met you, Howard, as you know.
Yes, via the old TikToking world.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's wonderful to watch your videos and to learn about your perspectives. And there are so many connections to things I've been thinking about, but you're looking at it from a different geographical, disciplinary, or and all manner of other sort of nuances and perspectives. So it's very exciting to learn about things that, as I said, at one level are familiar, but then I'm going, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. So and so it's all the fun of sort of connecting and learning, and that's why I thought it was really keen to have a chat with you. So welcome and thank you so much. I wonder if I've been asking people whether they're established academics or they're postgraduates or postdocs. How did they get to be doing what you do? Because I think it's really important these interviews give prospective students and the public a sense of how does one become a lecturer in classical studies, or how does one get to be you? How did it all begin?
Well, I guess that question, there are multiple different ways into that question, right? There's one that is the kind of careerist version, which is, how do you get to be lecturing classical studies?
Yes.
And for me, that was a very, in some senses, very traditional route. I did classics and English was my BA at Oxford. I then stayed there, did the master's in Greek and Latin languages and literatures. I got some funding to do my PhD, so I did my PhD there, still in classics in the Department of Classical Languages and Literatures.
Right.
But I was working, within a field that is called classical reception. So what that means, broadly speaking, is I was interested in questions around how the post-classical world, or how the world later than antiquity deals with questions of ancientness, ancient texts, ancient ideas, those kinds of things. So that's how I would answer it in a careerist sense. If you want me to answer that question in a sort of interest sense, how did you become interested in this stuff? I have to tell you about a night market in Singapore. So I don't know if you want that.
Go for it. Go for it.
So I always say that, when people ask the question, how did you become interested in the ancient world? Which people often do ask that question, because I think still now there's this perception that studying, especially Greek and Latin, is a kind of useless thing to do in the modern world. And people are sort of like, well, why were you interested in that? And for me, it was really a literary interest. I was interested in writing more than I was interested in specifically the Greeks and the Romans. I think at the time, when I embarked on this whole quest to study the ancient world, I didn't really know there was anyone apart from the Greeks and Romans. I thought that was sort of as ancient as you can get. And maybe we'll come on to later. I've unthought that thought many times over the last few years. So maybe we'll come on to kind of the politics of that idea later on. Yeah. But for me, I did very much have an interest in a completely different ancient world, not the Greeks and Romans at all, from very early on. Like I remember very clearly when I was a child, and as a child I kind of moved all over the world. I had this very strange displaced childhood where I grew up in various different places, including Belgium, including Singapore, including Thailand.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, all kinds of places. And it was when I was living in Singapore, I must have been 7. I remember that I was 7 because in French, they call the age 7 l'âge de raison, the age of reason. So they think of it as like the moment where you're still a child, but suddenly you become kind of reasonable. You can think about things. But anyway, I remember sort of being 7 and being at one of these kind of night markets in Singapore City where we were living at the time with my parents. And, it was hugely busy. There were kind of fish in tanks, all these kinds of things. And I was walking along and there was a man with a stall where he was selling what I now know are called Bowding balls. I didn't know that at the time, but they're basically these little metal balls and you have 2 of them and they come from kind of Chinese traditional medicine. And what you do is there are two balls and you hold them in your hand and you turn them with your thumb and your finger. And it's all about kind of training your wrist muscles, but it's also about kind of relaxation. But they make these Baoding balls the most incredible noise. And as I was standing there, at the age of 7, watching this man very skillfully, doing tricks with these balls in his hand, and they make this incredible ringing noise. And I was kind of watching him, and he said, "This is the sound of the old world. Can you hear the sound of the old world?" And I was like, whoa, this guy he's got some kind of almost like a phone line to the old world in his hand. I was completely hooked. Of course, unfortunately, when I was a bit older than 7, I realized it's not at all true that they sing the song of the old world. What actually happens is that there's like it's a larger metal ball with a smaller metal ball inside it. And when you turn them, it's like a chime. One of them hits the other. But I think that was the moment where I thought, there's another world here, like just out of reach, a kind of older world. And it sounds completely different to the one in which we live now. And I was sort of hooked on that. And that has become almost now like a sort of structuring metaphor for me, this idea that there are all these other ways of living, right? We don't have to organize the world in the way that we've organized it today. There are all these other ways of living that you can hear if you listen carefully enough to a kind of older world. So it became this kind of big image for me, really.
Wow. And that's a wonderful image. I'm still that's going to stay with me, I can assure you. Sort of thinking about and I don't think I ever had an age of reason. I think I just stayed a fool right the way through. But maybe one day I'll get to that level. But no, it's lovely to have those moments where you suddenly something endures and keeps you interested through your subsequent life and studies, and you can reflect on it. I suppose its meaning will change as you change, and you think back onto it. That's fantastic.
I used to be really embarrassed of it for a long time. I used to really because when you meet other classicists, because it tends to be the case, at least in Britain, that classicists come from certain kinds of social backgrounds, not all of them, but the vast majority of them, because of the inaccessibility of Greek and Latin in state schools in the UK.
Yeah.
So it tends to be that, people will tell this story of, I remember my father reading the Odyssey to me of my bedtime reading when I was 4 or something. And I've never identified with any of that stuff. I've never had a way of explaining that. But those are the kinds of stories you hear, right? And I've never really had one of those stories. But it's only recent that I've thought, no, I did have a connection with the ancient world. It just wasn't, Homer and bedtime reading.
But then what I said actually does make sense, because as you said, as you've emerged as a scholar, you've increasingly moved away from Greece and Rome as the sort of foundational narrative of that ancient world. But we can come back to that. But so how did that lead you through being at Oxford and becoming a teacher and researcher? What kind of research have you been doing with that training and that background and that?
Well, I did classics in English as my BA. The idea had been to do English. I was actually living in Belgium at the time when I made my university application, and it just seemed like a challenge to do English literature because we hadn't really done an awful lot of English literature. That seemed like a great idea. And I had this sense of wanting to do the long history of literature, and not wanting to kind of just begin with Gilgamesh, not wanting to kind of just begin with Beowulf, but to go much earlier. And as I said at the time, I think I probably thought that the Odyssey really was the very beginning of everything. So I had this idea that's what I was going to do. I was going to go and study literature, and I did that, and then carried on, did the PhD. I wrote my PhD on blindness, and specifically ableist narratives about blindness. And I was sort of asking the question, why can't we make ableism go away? Why is it that these kinds of narratives about blindness, to give you an example of one, for instance, the idea that blind people can see the future, or one that's still very common in the modern world is that blind people hear better, right? That, for instance, blind people make really good piano tuners because they have superior hearing.
Yes, I've heard that. Yeah.
All of these kinds of myths, really. I mean, I don't necessarily mean like ancient myths when I say that, but they really are kind of myths about blindness. And what I was really interested in was, first of all, where do those come from? And secondly, why can't we stop? We have known for decades. I think it was in the International Year of Disability in 1980 was the first time there was a real attempt to say, stop circulating these kinds of myths and tropes about disability. They're dangerous, they harm people, they restrict people's lives. But of course, it doesn't, that's not how meaning works. You can't just say, stop making this mean the following thing and people will do it. They don't do that. People are disobedient. So what we've got, in terms of these ableist narratives, and I later obviously came to understand that this was also true of racist narratives, of all kinds of prejudice narratives. What we've got is a situation where ideas circulate, for instance, the connection between blindness and prophecy, or blindness and punishment is another really good one. The idea that you're blind because you've been punished, and those things circulate even though we know they're super harmful. So I was trying to answer the question, where do they come from and why are we still doing this? And where I kind of came to was that the answer to both of those questions was because we think they come from Greek myth. So, we kind of set up this idea that they come from things like the myth of Oedipus, the guy who blinds himself, having discovered that he's murdered his father and had sex with his mother, that they come from the story of Hecuba, these kind of famous blinding myths from the ancient world. And of course, it is true that those sorts of tropes that I'm talking about are apparent in those myths. But the problem with saying, okay, we still use them now because we inherit them from Greece and then eventually from Rome. The problem with saying that is it makes us in the present powerless to do anything about that. We end up saying, it's almost like it absolves us of responsibility. We end up saying,
an authority and a get out clause, as you said. You
exactly.
can say, oh, well, yeah, that's fascinating.
Exactly.
I hadn't thought of it that way at all.
So that for me made me think then very differently about this thing that we call the classical world, because suddenly, I was sitting looking at all of these actually pretty dangerous tropes that we continue to use because we think that we inherit them from the Greeks and the Romans. So that became, that idea that we're sort of using ancient Greece especially, but to a lesser extent Rome, as an excuse for various harmful things, that became something that was very important to me in my research, even though my research now has sort of shifted on slightly from that. I'm not so much writing about blindness anymore. I sort of came to realize that same logic, that we use Greece as an excuse for the bad things we continue to do in the modern world, that became something that structured how I think about things like contemporary racism, for example.
Wow. I mean, I just have to, as a segue, I have to say that I was at the Theoretical Archaeology Group conference just before Christmas, and there was a whole session with a title. I was not a participant. I was just in the audience on, does anyone ever listen? Outrage is a method of evolving activist archaeology. And I knew that the two parameters of particular discussion I hadn't really quite dawned on me. I saw them in the abstracts, and then one was about trans identities and transgender issues and non-binary issues on the one hand, and the other as an activism surrounding that. But the other one was about disability activism, and there was a number of papers, and the co-organizer is a doctoral researcher at York, and I learned so much from listening to that session, because some of it I knew about the ableist language used by particularly bioarchaeologists, and about this kind of, oh look, they were really short, and yet people obviously thought they were almost human and kept them, or not. I mean, that's not exactly what people say, but those kinds of look, they only had the use of X or Y, and from the bioarchaeological evidence from, say, the Bronze Age or the Paleolithic, and yet people obviously cared for them as if this is a sort of special pat on the head of ancient people, that they weren't totally horrible to people, or they saw value in human life that wasn't quite what our ableist narrative is. And maybe even my terms there are wrong, but the point I'm trying to get at is the it really was an eye opener for me. I'd seen written discussions of it, but it was seeing paper after paper addressing how we're struggling with this across disciplines, and I was So when I knew we were going to be talking, I just wanted to, hope you don't mind me sort of doing a shout out to those postgraduates who were organising that session, and because I thought it was a fascinating topic, but also deeply unsettling for me and everyone else, because it reveals how much of our own sort of baggage is bound up in all of this, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I don't mind you at all doing the shout out. I think it's actually really important that we say that there is a huge amount of work being done through approaches that come through disability studies and disability justice movements. And a lot of that work is being done by our junior colleagues, right? By graduate students, by early career folks. And a lot of it is being done by students and scholars who are themselves disabled. So it's coming out of an experience also of their own marginalization within a discipline, and its exclusionary structures. But I think what this comes down to for me, there's a sort of link between different kinds of prejudice here. And in what I'm about to say, it's very important that I not be misunderstood, because I'm not about to say that racism, ableism, queerphobia, misogyny, I'm not about to say that those things are all the same.
No.
But where I think they are connected up is this idea that so I think that those prejudices come about because they assume that bodies are readable, are legible, that if we look at a person, the way that they're embodied should tell us something about the character of that person. So when we make, for instance, racist assumptions about somebody, we assume that the way we racialize them says something about their character, their ability, their capacity, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And one question that really, really interests me, and interested me throughout my book on blindness, which eventually came out, thank goodness, at the end of 2023. But the question that sort of interested me throughout that was, whose idea was it that bodies are readable in the first place? Because actually, we are all physically different, right? No two humans are the same. Physical difference is simply something that, we all live with. We are all different, each of us to each other. What's happened is that, societally speaking, we've established a series of norms, completely socially established norms, to which we hold bodies. And, we sort of rank bodies using those ideas of norms. And a huge amount of ink was spilled in disability studies trying to decide, when does the idea of norms, or in disability studies, it's often called the normate body. That means, the body designated as normal by society. There's a lot of ink spilled, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, it's very interesting work.
Yes,
try and determine kind of when those norms came about. But the answer, I think, really has to do with how we relate to the past. And it comes back to this same point that I'm making, that we use, in a way, the ancient world as an excuse. I mean, the number of times that people will say the phrase in Greek, kalos kagathos, right, beautiful and good, as if, so the idea that people often are trying to promote when they say that is that the Greeks thought that beautiful people were good people. So that it was the Greeks who made, apparently, according to this argument, I don't agree with it, as you can hear in the tone of my voice.
But
the idea that the Greeks thought that kind of physical perfection or physical beauty, or in other words, meeting certain norms, meant that you were a good person. And whether the Greeks actually thought that or not, I mean, you only have to read a very rudimentary book on Greek myth to understand that certainly not every Greek thought that, even if occasionally you might meet a Greek who did. But even if they did, this is really the question for classical reception, is, does that make it okay for us to do it in the modern world simply because the Greeks did it? And the answer has to be no, because otherwise you'd have to agree with all of the other horrific stuff that people in the ancient past, have sometimes done or been charged with doing. So it's really a question about how we relate to the ancient past, I think.
And this is through art and literature and many other media, I guess, isn't it? It's that ideas of beauty that I mean, it's always the Bond villain who does this, but but it's also, we somehow internalize that as well, don't we? This art connoisseur, this idea of purity and ideal. I don't know, is that kind of part of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there are so many stages of misinterpreting the ancient world that comes from. I mean, the obvious one, the one that is constantly brought up, is assumptions of whiteness around statues, you know, which
Yes.
we of course know is nonsensical. But there are various ways that we could look at that as misinterpreting the ancient world. But something that has interested me, you know, more recently in research that I've been doing as part of a project that I call, or that we call collectively, Critical Ancient World Studies, about which I co-edited with Mother Uma Chandran a volume last year. One of the questions we've been asking there is it right to characterize these kinds of misinterpretations as simply mistakes made about antiquity? Or is there part of us needing to think about the fact that these mistakes actually also create antiquity? In other words, you know, if we want to imagine, if we want to have a more critical relationship with the ancient past, do we need to simply know the ancient past better? Is it that these kinds of racist assumptions, ableist assumptions are just mistakes? Or do those things actually shape what we think of when we think of Greece and Rome? And I'm coming round to thinking that it's the latter. I'm coming round to thinking that this thing that we call classical is actually a sort of social construction that we have made. And I've done research on the way that periodization is a social construction that is specifically Islamophobic. That's something that particularly interests me. But if we think of it as a kind of the classical as a kind of social construction of modernity that we've then used to legitimate all kinds of prejudices, you know, colonial and otherwise, and colonialism plays a really important part in this story, then I think the type of work we have to do, to me, becomes very, very interesting.
So you've got this body of work exploring, would you still use the term reception theory, reception approaches, or have you rejected that term completely now? What would you characterize, you know, Well,
I mean, classical reception is within the field of classical studies. I think this is still true. It was certainly true until very recently. It is the fastest growing subdiscipline of classics. And, you know, there are huge numbers of people who are interested in it. It's also often the public's kind of very first foray into the ancient world is through some kind of modern retelling of an ancient myth or something like that. So it's very, very important that we get this right. It's very, very important, you know, that because it has a huge influence on how people imagine the ancient world. So I do think of what I do, you know, when I talk to classicists, I think probably all academics do this, right? They describe what they do slightly differently depending on who they're talking to.
Yeah, of course.
And certainly when I talk to classicists, the easiest way for me to explain what I do is to say that what I do is classical reception. And if you think of classical reception, I think the shift that was really made, you know, when classical reception studies starts to become a thing, which, you know, some people would say it does with something like Charles Martindale's Redeeming the Text. Other people would say, you know, it's much earlier than that. But when classical reception starts to become much more popularized as an approach, what really happens, I think, is a shift in how ancient things make their meanings. So we stop, I think, or I think classical reception is an invitation to us to stop thinking that we have to search for some kind of one true meaning that is, you know, buried from antiquity, and we have to, if we read enough, we'll discover it one day. And instead, if we think through classical reception, we end up saying, okay, but meaning is not found, meaning is made, right? Meaning, and it's made through the interaction between a reader and a text, and also through all of the various interactions that, you know, texts have with other readers, other environments, other contexts. So in that sense, it shifts what we're doing when we're studying the ancient world. You know, we're no longer trying to find that one true meaning that the author put in the ancient text and we just have to get back to it. We're trying to study a much more dynamic process of meaning making. So that part I've certainly kept from classical reception, although I would say the designation classical is the bit I have much more of an issue with nowadays.
Okay, for those who aren't familiar with it, and I get confused, what is the fundamental objection to the disciplinary definition of classical studies and the classical past?
Okay, so I'll tell you what I think many people's objection to it is, and then I'll tell you what my objection to it is.
Okay.
It's slightly different.
Okay.
So when we use the word classical, there are different ways of defining the word classical. Some people look back to various Latin texts where the word classicus is used. In fact, interestingly, in one usage, it's used to distinguish between a writer who is classicus and the opposite, a writer who is proletarius. That's to say, where we get our word proletarian from. So you can already see in that example that I'm bringing up, you can already see various classed aspects of the classical, but you can also see some idea of cultural value creeping in. There's also within that same usage the idea of being earlier, because the classicus is set up as being antiquior in Latin, so earlier, more ancient than the proletarius. But the issue comes where we make a slippage in English, and we use classical mostly to mean Greek and Roman. Although that's, of course, not true outside of academic study, because people will talk about classical music or a classic film or a classic car. So you can see there the kind of connotation with cultural value, because when you say about a film, oh, it's a classic, you don't mean it's got gladiators in it, right? You mean it's got some kind of transhistorical value. That's usually what you mean. So a lot of the rejections of the term classical that have come about recently, and there have been many, some of them have focused on what they see as an exclusionary geographical extent to the classical. So that argument would run something like, it's unfair for us only to consider Greece and Rome, and Greek and Latin linguistically, because that neglects a huge part of the ancient world. I don't know, ancient Africa, ancient China, ancient India, the ancient Caribbean, wherever else. So that's a kind of a critique that we might call, globalism or global classics, and we've seen similar critiques. I mean, I know that you're aware of various kinds of critiques in other fields as well. Medieval studies has had that same kind of global medieval shift too, I think.
Yes, to some extent, yeah. I'm on the edge of that type of conversation because of my geographical focus, but I'm certainly aware of it. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be one critique of the term classical. Well, there's two there, isn't there? We've talked about. One is an association with cultural value, so the notion that classical means better than something else. The other is this kind of narrow geographical focus, which probably isn't that fair to the actual inhabitants of classics departments who, in fairness to them, have never solely focused on this idea that's in the popular imagination of kind of Athens in the 5th century and Rome in the 1st century. It's always been broader than that. But I think the global classics critique has really been to say it should be really much broader even than what you're calling classical in terms of, language and everything else. I have a slightly different critique of the term classical, which is that I think that and this is, my book that I'm working on at the moment, which I want to call, I don't know whether the editors are going to allow me to do this, but I want to call the book Classicism, Western Conceptions of the Occident, because I want it to sound very obviously like a response to Edward Said's Orientalism, Western Conceptions of the Orient of 1978. But the reason I want to do that is because what I want to argue is that classicism, or in other words, the creation of this thing called the classical, is, historiographically speaking, Islamophobic. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we create this idea of a period in time defined by being pre-Islamic, because even though the folks in late antiquity studies have been doing amazing work to try and connect up early Islam and the classical, even in spite of that work, the vast majority of people still think of the fall of Rome as being in some sense connected with the rise of Islam, and Islam being the kind of line that we draw after the classical. And so what we've essentially got, if we then go and plow all of our resources for studying the ancient world into this thing called the classical, which we have historically done, right? Tell me one ancient Africa department that is as well resourced as a classical studies department. Even, as I'm saying that, I don't want to be sort of insensitive to those colleagues in classics departments that are really, really struggling for resources. But part of the reason why, if we look at the sort of history of that struggle, part of the reason why that's the case is because historically, in comparison with all of the rest of the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans have been vastly over-resourced, right? That's not an argument for making colleagues redundant now, by the way, absolutely not. But
No.
and that making redundant is not being done by the decolonial folks. It's being done by, a Tory government and its legacy and, university administrators.
Yes.
So those two things need to be disentangled. But if we then go and plow all of those resources into studying this thing called the classical, which we've defined as pre-Islamic, what we essentially do is create a narrative where Muslims are a kind of scandal in the history of the world because they are the people who have no ancient history. And we see this come up in all kinds of Islamophobic discourses. We see people say that about refugees, for instance, that they don't belong in Europe. We see people say, that Muslims, the French government says this all the time, that Muslims need to prove their allegiance to the French nation, as if they were somehow latecomers to that idea of nation. And that job, I think, of making Muslims seem like people who come late to the history of the world and a kind of an interruption to that history, that job, I think, is done by this idea of the classical and the kind of notion that everyone finds their origin in the ancient world, except Muslims.
Yes, that's really interesting, and I've encountered this in archaeological terms, and I haven't got a very sophisticated way of articulating it. For me, the Islamic world sits in the Middle Ages and is pickled within that Middle Ages, but it's not everyone else's Middle Ages. It's a separate, completely different planet's Middle Ages, and it's simultaneously a time of art and sophistication and architecture and science, and yet also utterly barbaric and violent and something we don't want. Not me, I'm saying this is the stereotype. I was just talking about generic speech of last week in a TikTok about how the term medieval comes up in a largely derogatory way, and this is not just about Muslims, but it is part of that mix. And they don't get the Islamic world doesn't get to inherit that classical tradition. It gets to sit after and out and off and somewhere else that we can then point at as other. Is that fair, or is that a bit over the top? I don't know.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I would say even more than other, what happens is Muslimness becomes almost an affront to that classical tradition. We end up with, and this is where kind of those extremely Islamophobic narratives around the clash of civilizations, Samuel Huntington's, big thing, where this idea of Islam and the West being perpetually in confrontation, I think that has a kind of historiographic analog, which is the idea that Muslims caused the fall of Rome. And that ends up being, even though, the vast majority of specialists, I think, probably don't believe that to have been truly the case, that becomes the kind of starting point of this idea of the clash of civilizations. And it becomes how we understand contemporary Muslimness too. One of the things that I made a TikTok about the other day was the 2015 destruction of Palmyra by the so-called Islamic State. And what I was saying was, as horrific as that destruction was, and obviously it was absolutely completely heinous, what was for me fascinating about that 2015 moment is that was talked about as if it was the first time that that monument had ever been destroyed, as if this monument was kind of completely untouchable. But of course, that's not the case. Of course, the last people to destroy Palmyra, or to give it the name that most people in the world give it, Tadmor, the last time Tadmor had been destroyed, it wasn't by any kind of Muslims at all. It was by French colonial archaeologists who had gone into a living mosque, a living town, had moved all of this is in the late 1920s, had moved all of the people out of the town, dismantled the mosque in order to produce the ancient temple that we know that the Islamic State, later destroyed. So I'm not saying this, just to be clear, I'm not saying this to say, well, in that case, acts of destruction are okay, not at all. I'm simply saying it really shows us how this idea that Muslims are the destroyers of classical antiquity remains with us, even though the biggest destroyers of classical antiquity are probably, European and Eurocentric archaeologists.
But I think in popular conversations now, I find on social media, there is a broader understanding of colonial archaeology and imperial archaeologies and national archaeologies and their different interleavings as appropriating the past, of plundering the past. But the idea that you're raising there is perhaps less in the public consciousness. Is the flip side, is it's the exorcising of whole later layers of history,
Yeah.
a millennium of or more of Islamic period archaeology to reveal as if there was never, and you see this from the physical sites to the heritage tourism to the Wikipedia pages, played out. So you will have discussions of sites that have recently been the target of various bombing, and they will talk about their classical phases, and then suddenly, how do we know about this site? What happened in the last 1,500 years? Oh, and then there was something that happened in 1962 or something. But there's literally as if there was no one there. It's a terra nullius. It's like it is an empty space. That, sorry.
And terra nullius is absolutely the appropriate phrase, isn't it? Because it goes to the heart of the coloniality of that enterprise. Because terra nullius, of course, is the phrase that is used to justify colonial appropriation of land, of resources.
We moved in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is the interesting thing about the classical, and this is what I mean when I say, the classical is a kind of social construct. This is what I mean, that when we think about those sites, all the other ways of thinking, if you think about, what was going on at Palmyra, Tadmor, before those French archaeologists came, and destroyed all of that living history that was there. That's not just artifacts, archaeological sites. It's not just information that we lost. It's actually whole ways of understanding history. Because what happened was that site was put back to a pretty short moment actually in the history of that site. And then what we learnt collectively, culturally from that is that moment really is the most important moment in the entire history of that site. And if you look at that idea that, the so-called classical origin, because I think the creation of origin stories is a big part of what this is about, particularly for nationalism, but maybe we'll come back to that in a moment, because I think what that does is create the idea that the classical origin matters more, even more than the living people on those sites. And we see that logic being argued, very, very murderously, for instance, in Palestine at this moment in time.
Absolutely. And one of my bugbears about this is that when I talk to students, I try to impress this, and I've done some modest writing about this, is that this isn't simply being played out from a British perspective, but this applies to other European nations too, but I'm talking from a British perspective. This isn't simply played out in places being colonized. This is also being negotiated in the British landscape. So not only in terms of the excavation of Roman period sites to reveal them to a certain early Roman layer and ignore the later layers, but also the defining of the relationship between the Roman past, the medieval, intermediate, and the modern age is being done by the same individuals who are also going to Ireland or going to Egypt or going to Greece or going to the Levant, and this is something that I think it's easy, even with this discussion, people tend to think, oh, this is Brits going elsewhere and doing this, but they're training and thinking from the 19th century in particular about the British landscape in a similarly colonial way. I don't know, that's just my particular thought on the matter, but I don't want to get derail into my rants about the British archaeology, but I think they're two sides of the same coin, is I suppose what I would say.
I agree totally with that, and I think that's because I think we have understood Eurocentrism wrong. I think we think of Eurocentrism as something that Europeans did to other people. But actually, I actually think Eurocentrism is almost like a superstructure of thinking outside of which it was almost impossible to think. It still is for many people almost impossible to think. So it doesn't surprise me at all that same idea, those same Eurocentric ideas that what the most important thing is the classical origin, are applying, at home as out in colonized places. And actually, my favorite example of this is how contemporary nationalism and especially ethno-nationalist projects are currently making use of this same story of origin, and they're not European, right? I mean, we could talk about ongoing European colonial projects that still do this. For instance, the Zionist project is very much still making this argument that this ethno-nationalist argument that one racialized group of people has a sort of ancient right to the land of Palestine. This is the same ethno-nationalist argument, but let's, just for the sake of argument, not think about it as it relates to European colonialism, but let's think about it as it relates to other kinds of contemporary nationalism that we wouldn't necessarily call European, because there's this very, very interesting thing that is going on at the moment in Saudi Arabia. I'm absolutely fascinated by it, which is that Saudi Arabia is at the moment engaged in essentially producing for itself a European Renaissance. And what I mean by that is it is trying to do what Europe did, in the Renaissance, which is produce for itself an idea of classical origin. Saudi Arabia is currently doing exactly the same thing. We can watch, a Renaissance play out in real time. And if you look at, just to give an example, there is as you know, probably much better than I do, there's an archaeological site in Madain Saleh in Saudi Arabia that's called Hedra. It's a Nabatean site, so, roughly the same age as Petra in Jordan. And until 2016, the people who are called the ulama in Arabic, that's to say the officially appointed Islamic scholars of Saudi Arabia, had said that you ought not to visit this site in Hedra because they'd identified it with a hadith, that's to say a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that they'd identified it as a place that the Prophet had said you shouldn't go according to a hadith. So they had banned, the visitation of this site. In 2016, these ulama suddenly changed their minds. Suddenly, Hedra was going to be developed. People, especially non-Muslim tourists, were going to be invited to visit it. And the state narrative was very much, this is ancient Saudi, right? Now, let's remind ourselves of something, right? The Saudi state is no older than 1932. The idea that there is such a thing as ancient Saudi is purely fabrication, just like the idea that there was such a thing as ancient Europe was fabrication for the European Renaissance too.
Yeah. And it's everyone can, and none of this makes the logic goes to the wayside. And I think people forget how there's often not a coherent vision when people talk about politics and nations, and they imagine there is people sitting in a darkened boardroom planning this out. And even when you look at the most gratuitous of regimes like Nazi Germany, you see that there's the crazies with their spiritual going to the Echtenstein and thinking they're digging up some ancient Teutonic temple, but most of them have completely rigorous scientific ideas that you could probably are fine with the method and you get a sense of what they're trying to do, but then there's contradiction. Other people go, no, we should do this, and I think this is just the case with this. When money and heritage tourism comes in board, I don't want to mischaracterize it, I don't know enough about it, but I've always thought that Egyptian archaeology is very much like a neo-colonial project by a nation state that is not European in some sense. I don't know if that's a fair characterization, but in the sense that it's driven by that thirst for particularly American tourists, European tourists, for that past and the research culture, the news stories. Israel's own antiquities service has very accomplished archaeologists, and from the ones I know, very different political orientations, and yet of course the soft power of the news stories, the overwriting, there's so much political drive there, and it's and likewise all these nations are trying to grab for their bit of the same discourse because it's working on that global stage, I suppose. I don't know.
And I think the thing about money and tourism is sort of one level of analysis. I think there's something else here, and this goes back to my point about classicism being structurally Islamophobic in my view, because if you think about there's a through line here. If you think about, well, what are Israel trying to do when they're trying to say that they have there's a kind of ancient Israel. Israel, like Saudi Arabia, was not created until 1948 by the Zionist project. So the idea that there's an ancient national idea of Israel in these archaeological sites can only be false. But yet, the idea is so powerful. But if you think about for a moment, what are they trying to do? They're trying to lay a pre-Muslim claim to this idea of nation, the idea of a presence of this thing that they call Israel in Palestine. Let's now connect that up with the other examples that well, some of which we haven't mentioned, but other moments where we get this kind of renaissance in places that aren't Europe. And I'm using that term Renaissance in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, but it allows me also to explain that the European Renaissance was similarly a political thing. It's not that Europe had a real one and everyone else is having a pretend one.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's that they were all pretend. But if you look at, for instance, after the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate and the declaration of the Republic of Turkey in 1924, you get the same thing. You get Mustafa Kemal building huge numbers of Hittite museums in Ankara in order to fabricate this idea that the Republic of Turkey, which was new that year, had an ancient history via Hittite history. And the Hittites were obviously very useful because you could claim then, some kind of that you were as old as the Greeks and Romans kind of thing in the history of the world. But it also served to get rid of this kind of transnational idea expressed through the Muslimness of the Ottoman Caliphate, and instead of that idea, to install allegiance to a nation that you wanted to present as having been there from an ancient time. So I think we can actually see these projects connected up, first of all by nationalism, but secondly, and explicitly, coming about when people feel like nationalism and national identity really needs a boost, but also by a kind of Islamophobia, by a kind of desire to shift us from Muslimness being the primary category with which people identify towards nation being the primary category with which people identify. And of course, the danger of that is evident, from the example of the Israel Antiquity Service trying to do this, is that nationalism becomes ethno-nationalism in those kinds of arguments. That's to say, it becomes very easy once you've got an idea of ancient nation to make the argument that anyone who came late does not properly belong within that nation, right? And this is the point I was making about the classical being defined by being pre-Islamic. It's then very easy to make the case that you can get rid of the Muslims, which is how I understand the Zionist project currently working.
Very interesting, isn't it? Because one level, people, and I'm obviously not saying this is the way, but wouldn't you want to? I've seen people have said in my comment section, hey, you're criticizing Irish nationalism. Shouldn't they get a pass because they were subject to colonialism for so long by the British? So why, there you are with your British accent. Why are you talking about the fact the Irish Free State mobilized archaeology so fervently in the 1920s, 30s, and that golden age of Christianity model, which has been so harmful for that state and its relationship with the Catholic Church, and yet people will defend that to the hilt because it was the good fight against British imperialism. My point where I'm going with this is surely we should give new nations a pass. Surely we should give countries in South America or Africa who are configuring their own post-colonial nationalisms around archaeology and history and the deep time past. Surely they should get a little, okay, we'll criticize it a bit, but give them a chance, because I'm not saying I agree with that, but surely that's what I've seen said to me when I bring these issues up. You're the mean Brit. You should back off.
This is such an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think it's a kind of unresolved question mark, or maybe a failure in decolonial, kind of normative decolonial ways of thinking. And exactly as you've just described that argument about Irish nationalism, the same thing is said to me about Greece, right? Yeah. When I, say things like the Greeks didn't invent democracy, that's a nationalist narrative, which is also a Eurocentric narrative because, of course, most of Europe kind of piggybacks off Greek nationalism. When I say that, you will often get, particularly Greeks, but not just Greeks, saying, but how else do you want a new state to create itself, basically? And I have less sympathy for it in the case of Greece. I do have more sympathy in the case of kind of newly decolonized places, where a lot of decolonial activism is organized around nationalism, around the idea of, national freedom. you could sort of trace that, in various liberation projects. But what I think is going on here, and here is where I think that, historians, archaeologists, people who deal with the ancient past could be really useful, because I think we're doing a disservice to the project of decoloniality, which I think is an important, global project. No one could accuse me of not being pro-liberation. But I think that we're doing a disservice to that project if we only encourage it to articulate itself in terms of nationalism. And
Absolutely.
I think the reason it's doing that is because we, people who are responsible for communicating about the ancient past, have insufficiently furnished a diet of examples beyond nationalism. We've made that mistake. We've used this idea of methodological nationalism when we for instance, you take the example of ancient Mesopotamia, right? When someone begins talking about Mesopotamia, and as you know, I despite only really being a hobbyist of the Sumerian language, I think my most successful series on TikTok is that I teach the Sumerian language on Sundays. I call it Sumerian Sundays on TikTok. And one of the things that people always ask is, where is Sumer? Where is Mesopotamia? And the answer, if you put that in Wikipedia, the answer that you will get is Iraq, or Iraq, Iran, and a bit of Kuwait. That's the kind of answer that you'll get. Yeah, and what that is methodological nationalism. What you're doing there is you're retrojecting, modern nation states onto something that is transnational. The same thing happens with the Ottoman Caliphate, right? The Ottoman Caliphate is explicitly a transnational project that's not bounded by nation. That's the whole point of a caliphate. That's why a caliphate is different to a nation. And still, when people talk about that, they say, oh, yes, it was Turkey, it was Bulgaria, it was, that's how we make things comprehensible for modern audiences, is we use the language of modern nation. But I think what we're doing when we do that is we're doing the modern world a disservice, because we're not giving the modern world all of that kind of transnational language that we could otherwise be formulating to talk about the world.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I do see both sides, and I'm guilty of it too. Depending on context, you've got to give people a geographical mooring. But I've been not guilty. I'm guilty of doing that, endorsing that, but I've also been deliberately contriving to undermine that myself for the nations of this island. So I do a lot of, some of my most controversial TikToks have been trying to point out that the Welsh were in Scotland and the English were in Scotland, and Scottish nationalists don't like this at all, because it confuses their sense of core romantic identity, which is Gaelic, but also they want the Picts. They don't want to understand the Picts, they want the Picts there, but they don't want the English and they don't want the Welsh. Not the terms that would have been used then, but our modern terms for people, old English speakers, Brythonic speakers, they don't understand that aspect. And I think it's really important. The same with England, trying to explain to people, well, all of this would have been Brythonic speakers up until X, and they, it's England, and yes, it's not one or the other. It's trying to disrupt those geographical. So I totally agree with you, but also I kind of sometimes I'm active in dismantling it, and other times I'm just trying to get people to learn where I'm talking about, because they don't look at maps. So I'm kind of guilty of slipping into that a lot, because I think, wow, people need to, for this communication or for this conversation with students in a classroom, I need to but yes, Syria, that whole Fertile Crescent, which is a term in itself which has problems, because I do lectures on the origins of Old World domestication, all these terms, but I talk about Mesopotamia, and then I talk about Syria and southern Turkey, and people are very confused about the geography because of these arbitrary lines of 20th century, or I think 20th century. They're 20th century, aren't they? Yeah, it's all this kind of post, imperial baggage. So so I think it's absolutely essential. So I totally agree, and I'm just rambling now, but I'm just
I think it's also not just essential. For me, it's one of the most exciting things that the ancient world can do for us, is it can help us to rethink things like national boundaries. I think for too long, in my opinion, we've been locked into having to try and explain the ancient world in the language of the modern world. And as you say, sometimes that's just pragmatic. Sometimes you just want to tell someone where something is, and you have to use the geography they've got to map onto the ancient geography. But what I think is even more interesting is what kind of questions does the ancient world allow us to ask of the modern world? If we don't think of Greece as ancient Greece, I mean now, if we don't think of that as being bounded by the modern nation state of Greece, which it wasn't, I don't think there's not a person in the world who would disagree. But when most people think of Greece, they think of the modern country, and that plays into how we imagine that classical antiquity, because they don't think of North Africa necessarily as being an important part of that. They don't think of the Balkans necessarily as being an important part of that, and so we end up with these kinds of issues which, going back to what I said right at the beginning, these things aren't just mistakes. They actually come to structure how people imagine the history of the world and how people imagine how we relate to each other now. We are in this moment of where ethno-nationalism, is literally causing, the kind of horrific treatment of refugees and migrant people, where we have enormous numbers of people dying on incredibly treacherous journeys, precisely because we are enforcing these made-up boundaries. But though we think of that as a modern political problem, and of course it is, but for me it's also a historiographical problem that what could be really exciting about being people who know about the ancient world is that we could be offering alternatives to that kind of nationalism, whether it's, different types of relationships, whether it's linguistic relationships, whether it's different ways of thinking about how people relate or how we group people that aren't, inventions of coloniality like race, that aren't nation and these kinds of things. We have the keys to do that stuff, and I think we should be doing more of it.
It's the anachronisms and the constantly pivoting and concepts and terms and language. I'm just trying to hold myself back from ranting about an example I literally just read. I'd read it before, but before I got very angry about it. This is from a big monster of a peer review paper from 23 years ago about DNA and the origins of the English, and has a sentence in it. And conflict between the Welsh and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued for over a long period. Offers Dyke, an earthwork barrier 240 kilometres long, was constructed circa 790 and provided a well-defined boundary between England and Wales. And a large part of my life at the moment is trying to explain to people there was no such thing as an England, there was no such thing as a Wales in this period, and yet this is one of the most pernicious things. It came up, I've ranted about this in print, about how this came up in the COVID pandemic, and the Welsh and the English rules were different, and people were mobilising, inventing not simply the term Offers Dyke, but were actually conjuring up a border equivalent to all of these other borders that they talked about in their popular discourse as a frontier to defend against the Welsh and or to defend against the English tourists. And a lot of it was jokey, but it was actually quite scary to see how rapidly it didn't really go anywhere. It all evaporated again, but how rapidly a long dead ancient earthwork suddenly was resurrected for about 18 months and used to fight internet wars about being English and being Welsh and how diseased or not they were. And it was really quite shocking to see how Offers Dyke got that, and that was from a ground roots of trolling and rather than a state down system. But the press got involved, and England suddenly its English consciousness of its boundaries suddenly gets another knock that then is mobilized when we're talking about small boats, and it's then mobilized in other and this all gets connected. And that's why I think these things, what's happening in Syria is absolutely about what's happening on the borders of Wales. It's all part, these conversations flow back and forth about nationhood and heritage and it's interesting stuff. I'm ranting now.
Well, I would never want us to stop decolonial liberation movements. So I think we have to be I think we have to recognize that it's not decoloniality that creates notions of nation. I think I wouldn't want anyone to listen to this and think, oh, well, Chella thinks all those decolonial revolutions are bad because they're nationalist. I mean, of course not. But I think what we're really talking about is power and how it expresses itself.
Yes, exactly.
And really what I would love is for those decolonial liberation movements to be able to express themselves in a language, that was not nation. Because if you look at what's going on. So this will be my last example of the Islamophobicness of the classical. But if you look at what's going on in India at the moment to Muslim minority populations in India, huge amounts of lynching, of Islamophobic violence, burning of mosques, those kinds of things. And those things are justifying themselves using a narrative that is actually speaking the language of decoloniality. It's really quite frightening, even though the narrative was taught to India, by British colonials. It's actually being used. So, basically what happened was Britain, when they go to colonize India, they say that they're going to liberate India from their Muslim colonizers, right? Even though, of course, as we know, Britain were there themselves to colonize it. But that's the kind of language that is used. And so now what you've got is this incredible Islamophobic violence being caused partly by that colonial narrative, that Muslims are, the presence of Muslims in India is somehow oppressive to real, non-Muslim Indians. I'm using massive air quotes here in case anyone is not watching the visuals while they're listening to this. So it's that same idea that Muslims, because they come late to the history of the world, are kind of late coming invaders. But one that narrative was given to India by British colonizers and is applying itself, or is using as its kind of raw material to do that. It's using Sanskrit. It's using the relationship between Hinduism and Sanskrit to, those kinds of Hindutva nationalists are making the argument that because Muslimness doesn't have that relationship with Sanskrit, which is, seen by those nationalists as the kind of ancient origin of India, therefore, Muslims are being killed. But what's not, I think, what's forgotten, we would be wrong to do so, but we could treat this as kind of the outcome of decolonization, right? Because obviously now that as India was trying to liberate itself from Britain, it was speaking a language of Indian nationalism. But what we would be neglecting, I think, is that specific argument, that true India was Sanskrit India, pre-Muslim India, was precisely the argument that the British were making in order to colonize India. Look at the amount of Sanskritists who, were a huge part, just as Napoleon famously took his classicists with him to Egypt. Britain, also took enormous numbers of Sanskritists and were making that argument around Proto-Indo-European that was about trying to connect, India with Britain in order to colonize India. So the problem with nationalism is, yes, sometimes for the purpose of revolution, you might have to kind of use nationalism. But the problem is that the language of nationalism is so close to ethno-nationalism that often that's also the language that then is used for Islamophobia.
Absolutely. It's a complex balance we have to have, but as scholars we have to shed a light on it and get engagement critically with it, don't we? Rather than and that's an ongoing project that's fascinating to hear about. And I'd love to hear where you're going next with your work. Then you've got a book. Could you reprise what you said about your next book idea and where this is going? So
yes, I'm writing this book at the moment. It doesn't yet have a publisher. It's kind of on submission in various places, but I'm writing this book at the moment that I hope I'm going to call Classicism, Western Conceptions of the Occident, which is a sort of it's about using Edward Said to read the Islamophobia of the classical, basically. So I'm working on that. I'm also writing, I'm under contract to write the very short introduction to classical reception for Oxford University Press. That little series of tiny books that you can read on the train. One of those on classical reception. So I'm working on that as well.
Wonderful. And I want to ask you as a final area, we've already mentioned that you are active. You put yourself out there to discuss these issues, to intersect nationality, colonialism, imperialism, religion, race, all these big, culture wars topics. How do you do it? How are you handling it? Because it can't be easy, and you must. What are your thoughts? Where are you feeling positive about it, or feeling a sense of dread in 2025?
It's a weird moment to have this conversation, isn't it? I mean, as you know, TikTok is about to just be banned for its American users. So um, plus Twitter. I mean, Twitter was my real first love of social media. Back in the day when it was just people talking about stuff they were enthusiastic about, rather than when it got kind of taken over by the alt-right.
Yeah.
But that, that was kind of my first love in terms of social media. That obviously is basically defunct now because it's owned obviously by Elon Musk, and it is a kind of nightmare place to be. So what's happened is kind of academics have gone to Blue Sky, but for me, Blue Sky doesn't quite do. I mean, I'm on Blue Sky, but it doesn't quite do the job that I want social media to do, because you end up, it's very collegial, but you sort of end up talking to other academics, and that's not really for me what social media is for.
No.
For me, social media is about communicating with people sort of outside of the ivory tower of academia, and trying to have not just a kind of one way, or I'm going to teach you about ancient Greece or ancient Rome or wherever. For me, it's not about that. For me, it's about trying to have conversations, trying to get people to unthink some of the received ideas that they have about the ancient world. And that sometimes makes social media not a very nice place for me, because when I first jumped onto TikTok, which I haven't been there that long, I think I've not quite been there a year on TikTok yet.
I hadn't realised. I thought it was I
Yeah.
just discovered you late, but okay.
No, I'm really new. I think it was like June or July or something that I joined TikTok. So I'm really new. But when I first joined, I just had the most horrific time, because I made this video, my first kind of, I mean, I say properly viral for me, probably not for you, Howard, but the first one that got to kind of 70,000 views or something like that.
Brig for me. Most of my videos go nowhere. It's ridiculous. It really is. I don't get consistent popular videos. It's just it's random. Yeah, go on. Yeah, that's great.
But that one, the first one, was a video where I tried to do this thing on I was doing this little series at the time that was called The Lies That Eurocentrism Has Told You About the Ancient World. And the first lie I did was the idea that the ancient Greeks invented democracy. And, I knew that it would be controversial. What I didn't know is that it would be dived on by enormous numbers of Greek nationalists, especially, and that they would. One of the things that I like least about social media is that rather than arguing with you, people will often insult you. People told me to get a boyfriend, various things, or told me that I was fat or I was ugly, or all these things, which had nothing to do with the argument in question that I was making. And I never have a problem arguing with people, but what I think
it's so infantile. You don't know how to respond. It's like
exactly.
It's like pigeon chess, isn't it? It's like that's the problem. I'm sorry, I cut across you, but
no, I was almost finished. I was just going to say, I think that was really it taught me two things. The first was that outrage can mean reach on social media, but that it doesn't always mean good reach. There's good reach and bad reach. You can have reach, but people are not actually listening. They're not taking it seriously. They're engaging, but only because they're annoyed and they want to upset you. And that's something different to what I think I've sort of managed to do a bit more recently, is have a group of followers who are watching because they're actually interested. They want to learn something. They want to think carefully about something. So I've ended up in a much nicer place on TikTok, but that kind of initial cold water immersion was quite frightening, sort of how quickly people would jump to extremely misogynistic, sorts of things.
Being femme presenting, being, there's so many things that I don't have to deal with. And I'm aware of those privileges, particularly when the rare occasion happens when someone says something. And it's usually because they've misunderstood that they think I'm of a different ethnicity, and they're thinking or they're insulting me via association with another ethnicity or another, sexual orientation or whatever it is. So it's like, it's not the fact that they're accurate. It's more just the fact that that's what they're doing to try and so I go through phases of getting, are you this, are you that, and another one of these, da da da. But it's not, doesn't really hit me much, but I realize I get upset because I realize how much this must affect people who this is literally Yeah, no.
Yeah.
But
And the way that I've started to look at that, I had to, when I first got onto TikTok, I had a couple of these videos that went viral sort of for the wrong reasons, let's put it that way. For these reasons that we're just talking about, not for more nefarious reasons. But I had to sort of have a serious talk with myself, and I had to say, look, the reason why people are upset is because their received version of how they understand the world is being challenged. That's why
yeah.
they're upset. And okay, it would be nice if people didn't respond that way when they were challenged, but it's still worth something to challenge them. It's still worth it for them to encounter that view. And perhaps if they encounter it enough times and in different circumstances, they might come round to it. So I think having a project on social media is really useful. I have a very clear epistemological project. I want to show people that the dominant narrative we have for understanding classical antiquity is Islamophobic. And I want to show people how to think differently about the ancient world. And if you have a project, I think that kind of anchors you in a sense, because people say things, but you just end up reading those things as proof that actually you've affected them in some way, you've challenged them in some way.
Yes, I agree. I agree, and I think it's about making sure you protect yourself, keep yourself safe. If it gets
Yeah.
too much, there's no obligation to keep going, but equally to stay with what your vision is for what you're trying to achieve. And I think that's really worthy and an appropriate way of thinking about it. And I wish I thought about it with that sort of precision, because I often sort of I'm more scattergun, I feel, and some things I think, well, this is on track, this is what I want to do, and then it goes nowhere and no one's interested. Okay, I thought that would really hit a spot, but then never. You can't predict what's going to happen. I thought I'd be getting better at it, but I'm just getting worse. So in terms of videos that I think are going in the right direction, and people are interested in this because it links to this popular conception, and I can no, this really dies, and then I'll do it really short, and it'd be pithy, and people no, they didn't like that either. So I don't know.
And sometimes it's disappointing what people do like. Sometimes you do something that's like really silly or whatever, and you think you're just doing it in 5 minutes as a joke or something, versus those videos that you've really thought about and you've really researched and put a lot of work into. And sometimes this really silly thing that you just did like in 2 minutes on a bus or something does really well.
I self-censor too much as well because I can't face the drama. So, for example, I had a video go viral because a friend sent me a Tolkien-style map of Wales, and I did a follow-up video where I alluded to actually some interesting political and cultural issues about mythologizing parts of the island and that hey nonny nonny romanticized vision that does link into coloniality and issues of that nature. And I've pulled punches, and I didn't do it. I was going to do a follow-up video and say it was a gift from a friend. It went viral, and I can use that. I thought, no, I don't want. I can't. I'm not in the mental state to go down that route now, because if I do, I know what's going to happen online. I'm going to get Irish people angry at me, Welsh people angry at me, the Little Englanders being Little Englandish, and then I'll probably find some other group will find outrage about something that I still haven't recovered from the Ogham or Ohm arguments of how to pronounce a long dead script, and because of course I know that there's two common pronunciations, but still the collective it's a certain selection of Irish men were very angry that I didn't call it Ohm, and so. So it's a running joke that only I'm finding funny, is that every time someone says you pronounced that wrong, I said it's pronounced Ohm. Because I get pronunciations wrong all the time, and I'm not doing it out of disrespect or and I correct myself all the time, but it's about that is an important point, but equally, that wasn't what I was talking about. So can we please not fixate on whether it's scone or scone or, bath or bath, and, but
you don't really realize how many things there are that someone could kind of nitpick at you for until you go on TikTok, and then suddenly everything about the way you speak, the way you dress, everything suddenly is open to be picked at by somebody. But
then they deliberately try and troll people, and they don't rise to it. So I went to Leicester and went, here I am in Leicester, and I'm enjoying that, and nobody said why did you say it like that? Yeah, because they obviously know and they saw through it, and I wasn't subtle enough. But you know, I have to be more cunning and try and get a rise out of people more.
I think there's that difficult balance on social media as well, isn't there? That in a way, I sometimes wonder if navigating some of these political aspects is more difficult for you than it is for me, because I mean, you've been on TikTok much longer than I have, but you also have so many more followers, some of whom follow you for your kind of searing political analysis of stuff. Some of them, though, I presume, follow you because they like looking at the cool stuff that you go and visit. In other words, they're not interested in politics. They think that it's possible to be apolitical about archaeology. I'm in a different position. I have far fewer followers, but I think that the vast majority of people who follow me, they're not, you know, there isn't that moment where they think, okay, well, I don't like this woman's politics, but I'm going to watch because she's doing this. I sort of don't have that group. So that makes a difference, doesn't it, in terms of how confident you feel saying something? Because for me, I know that people will be annoyed about certain things, but they're not in my followers list anyway.
Exactly, and I think that's the problem, is trying to be and having. I think that's good, because when you get too big, you do get these people who just following you for, keep out of the politics, please, mate. I want to just see the pictures of the pretty churches, or I want to see the pictures of the pretty ancient monuments. And I've had to deal with a few of those quite robustly. But also you get the betrayal, the fandom. I'm a Z-list celebrity. You betrayed me now by not exactly agreeing with everything I think on a particular issue. And I try. I don't keep out of politics, but equally I do keep out of politics. It doesn't matter for the project of my TikTok, even though I do care about certain things. I have nothing to say. I'm happy to mock Suella Braverman, who doesn't believe the Balkans exist. I was going to mention that earlier, and sort of, you know, but I'm not. And even in that, people are literally taking me seriously and thinking, "What's her game? She's a liar. She's saying it." And no, it was a joke. She's obviously just got it wrong. But we can use this as a moment to mock a broader problem. But you know, I don't want to get into the weeds of that kind of thing, because frankly, that kind of stuff is not my game. I haven't got the expertise in you know. I just thought I'd a quick quip about the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. You know, it was just as far as I could go. And there's someone in the comments going, "I'm from Croatia and the Ottomans never got here, and you're wrong, and you were 150 miles out and you're back." It doesn't matter. I just used the, you know, that's not what I was trying to do with that. And it's about trying to make sure I'm not rude to people. Well, I am rude to people all the time, but it's about trying to make sure that we keep on mission, isn't it, is the phrase, for what we're trying to achieve as educators, and you know, not be sidetracked. But
I think that's right. I think that's right. There are sort of limits, aren't there? Because, well, it's not a secret. The thing I dislike most in the world is people who think the past could be or should be apolitical. You know, this idea that, and people say it to me all the time. They say, "Oh, you're being political and I'm apolitical." And I think, well, no, you're not apolitical at all. You just happen to benefit from a perspective that is seen as apolitical by the vast majority of people. There is no such thing as an apolitical approach to the past. You know, at the same time, one of the things we have to do as educators, or as anybody who wants to make any kind of change in the world, is be able to talk to people who don't already agree with us, because otherwise, what's the point? You know, and you can't just spend your life as an educator telling people who already know things that they already know them. So It's always that really difficult balance, isn't it, of where do I say this strongly, where I really mean it and I really need it, but not just ask for outrage for the sake of it.
Yeah. Well, Chella, we could keep going on, because this is fantastic. And ranting, setting the world to rights, as my dad always used to say to me. Every time I got passionate about anything, he would say it sarcastically. Well, that's putting the world to rights. Anyway, but I think we have had a really good chat and understand where you go. And we'll put in the description all the links to your social media and your book, and so people can find you and your wonderful work, both academic and public engagement. What's the term you did? Outreach, engagement? I get confused between the different labels, but out there stuff.
I don't really know what term to use. I really want to know whether your dad clearly went to the same training school as my dad, because my dad also says, you know, every Saturday when I go to the Palestine protest, and whenever I speak to my dad, he'll say, "You put the world to rights then today, have you, Chella?" Yeah. So they must have gone to the same dad training school, I think.
Probably, I think it is a special breed of their elite training of that kind of commentary on anything that their kids do. Yeah.
Absolutely. But thank you so much for having me. This has been really such an interesting conversation.
Well, you take care and good luck with all your endeavours in 2025 and beyond. And I'm sure we'll see cross paths and interact many a time moving forward, despite the US ban, which is very frustrating. But thank you so much, Chella. It's been fantastic.
No, thank you.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.